The most dangerous car you can buy. That is a genuine headline from Jalopnik. A period piece from Car Magazine in the UK also accused the Mark II of being outright dangerous. But were these headlines right? I think the first instinct for most of us would be just to dismiss this as hyperbole, but in actual fact the answer is much more complicated than that. We can divide it up into three parts. Now, first of all, we need to go back to when the MR2 was designed. In the 80s, Japanese manufacturers were still at a stage where they felt that they needed to prove themselves. They were trying to move on from their image for making reliable, cheap, but boring cars. The 240Z did wonders for Nissan, but Toyota's effort with the Mark I Supra was half-hearted and definitely not a success. So with the MR2, they went for a purpose-built sports car, a clean sheet design with a mid-engine layout. Now the thing is, and this is the first part of the answer, that this kind of layout is already inherently prone to snap oversteer. But there's much more to it than that. Let's take it out. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story and, importantly, how it actually drives today. Now, the Mark I was a really successful car for Toyota. When the time came to replace it, they decided that they needed to move up market. The result, the Mark II that I'm in today, was a bigger car with more interior space, better appointed, a nicer interior. But the flip side was that it was also heavier. In order to try and retain some of the handling magic that made the first car so successful, they turned to Dan Gurney, a racing driver from the US. The car that then appeared, the very first version of the Mark II, was a really rewarding car to drive, but one that wasn't really ideally suited, on the flip side, to a novice driver or a not very experienced driver. And this is the second part of the answer. Ordinarily, mid-engined cars were exotics, they were Ferraris, they weren't accessible to the average driver. And they tended to be had by people who are a bit more experienced. The snap oversteer wasn't as much of an issue. When anyone ended up being able to buy one of these, it turned into a real problem. So far then, it appears that Toyota did nothing wrong. This car was simply a victim of its own success. It got to such a wide audience that there were too many inexperienced drivers with the keys in their hands, and that was the end of it. But in 1993, Toyota itself made some revisions to this. It was stung by that criticism, and it changed the geometry of the car and the wheels to make it more benign. Now, many people think that, in actual fact, that made it a less engaging car to drive. And had that been all it is, it would just have gone to reinforce what I've just said. But there was another major change that tells us a different story. Like many sports cars, these have adjustable toe at the back. That means that the angle at which the wheels are pointing or steering, it's fixed, but it can be changed. They have tie rods at the back that adjust that toe. As the suspension moves up and down on a car, the distance between the mounting point for the tie rod and the bit where it's mounted on the hub changes. When it compresses or it gets longer, the distance between the two changes. That alters the toe in and the toe out. And crucially, for this version, this revision, what Toyota did is that they increased the length of those rods. Now, the shorter the tie rod is, the more it's going to be affected by suspension movement, and the more it's going to be affected with bump steer, which would in itself cause unwanted, unwarranted oversteer. So this is really important, because to me it shows that there actually was a design flaw with the original car. Now, the one I'm in today is a revision 3, so I think it's a 1994 car, and it has all the modifications that I've just spoken about. So, interesting now to find out, has it dulled the handling, and is it still dangerous? Now, throughout its lifespan, there were a few other changes. When it was first launched, in the UK anyway, in Europe, there was a base 140 horsepower version, and then the tastier 158 horsepower GT. When the car was revised, power was actually up to 168 horsepower from 158. Now, initially that sounds like a good thing, but what that doesn't tell you is that the torque, the peak torque, was actually moved much higher up the rev range, and it was reduced at the same time. Many think that the reason why that was done was also to try and stop an inexperienced driver from getting into trouble, because with these cars with the higher horsepower, you actually have to be a lot more committed to be driving them fast. You have to rev them all the way through. So it's not going to happen by accident that you're just going to sort of go through a corner, put your foot down a bit too much, and then it will spin you off. You have to be committed to be going quickly. But the upshot is that this one, in many ways, feels slower than the previous version. It's a car that you absolutely have to rev. Now, it's quite greasy now, and it's not really ideal territory to be really thrashing a mid-engine car, even though this one's supposed to be safer. You have to keep it between 4 and 7 to get it to move, and there's a serious sort of uptick in power around 6,000 revs. At reasonable speeds like this, it's a really satisfying car to drive. The interior, these cars were always criticised back in the day for being boring, and I guess compared to maybe a Fiat Coupe, the interior is lacking in drama, but what it lacks in drama, it very much gets in quality. There's no rattles here. This is the T-bar roof version, so you've got lovely floods of light coming in as well. And ultimately, it's got a sporting layout, it's got a really good driving position. The gear change is quite short throw. There's a little bit of notchiness to it, which helps, I guess, in making the feel of positive engagement in it. But if you're trying to move really quickly, you can still do it. I do feel like it gets in the way a little bit. All the basics, they absolutely did get right. I have to say, I am also finding this engine to be just a little bit too peaky. In some ways, this is more of a GT car than the previous version. It's less go-karty, it's got a bit less precision to it. And a torquier engine, I think, would just work better. Let's just see how it feels going through the gears. And how it sounds as well. So far, it's not the most incredible sounding engine in that way. So foot to the floor. Yeah, so you really have to rev it, but it's a little bit of a rough sounding engine. So in a way, it's weird. It demands that you rev it, but it doesn't particularly encourage it. It's not terrible, but I wouldn't say it's the best attribute is the engine. Let's move down to going a little bit quicker now. As I said, it is very greasy here, but definitely feel that the rear end very slightly pivoting out of line there. No need to correct it. As long as your throttle, if you don't let go of the throttle, I didn't need to do anything else. So it feels pretty good actually. I mean, it's quite softly suspended, and I guess today not having huge amounts of grip with the rain is helping its cause. Maybe in the dry with some grippy tyres it would feel overly soft, but in these conditions feels like it's really well balanced as a chassis. So is this really the most dangerous car that you can buy? Well, I think that Jalopnik in their article, when they said that, the emphasis is very much on the you can buy. It's not that it's an atrocious handling car or a really dangerous handling car. It's simply that it's accessible to a lot of people who aren't used, or who weren't used to when it was new, driving a car like this. They didn't know how to handle it. Having said that, I think that before it was revised, there was definitely at least one design issue which needed addressing, and that is those rear tow arms. It is absolutely always important to have them as long as you possibly can, and they'll have less impact on the car. How do they drive now? I think that this drives absolutely lovely. So today, with the lack of grip that there was, it's been a really entertaining car. The steering is great, it's really satisfying to use, and you do get some of that mid-engine feel where the change of direction is quite effortless. It's also a very usable car. Now, if you wanted to buy one now, I think that sort of basket cases, they're not the prices they used to be. These basket cases you can find for around £2,000 or £3,000. The usable projects around the £5,000 or £6,000 mark. And the very best cars, like this one, this only has 55,000 miles on it. It's a one-owner car. It looks so clean, so nice. These go for 8K and above. Do I think it's worth paying that kind of money? I really do, actually. I think that they are great. You know, they were dismissed at the time as being copies of a Ferrari 348s, and that really takes away from the fact that it's actually a very pretty car in its own right, and it's nice to drive, and it's reliable and pretty cheap to run. One thing you do have to look out for is rust. Thank you all so much for watching. It is massively appreciated, and I look forward to seeing you for the next video.